So today we're going to talk about how to get a massive lens like this Mamiya RB67 90mm 3.8 lens onto a tiny little camera like this Fuji X-T2. So yeah, let's talk about this. So Liberty, welcome back. If you're new, make sure you subscribe to the channel. Make sure you hit the like button if you find this video useful. It helps out a lot. I do appreciate it. So let's talk about adapters, using vintage lenses, how to calculate crop factors, whether it be the lens or the camera, and just the reasoning behind it. Honestly, before recently, I never would have thought about using a medium format vintage lens on a regular full frame modern DSLR camera. But honestly, now that I'm getting into it, I think that if you're not really doing this, you're not taking full advantage of your vintage film lenses or these vintage film cameras. Now, let me just say, I am not the die-hard, I only shoot film guy, okay? Do I prefer shooting film? Yes. Do I like shooting film? Of course. But professionally, it just doesn't make sense, and I can't shoot film for a lot of the work that I do. And of course, I shoot a lot of video, so obviously that doesn't work either. But of course, I do like using that vintage glass as much as I can, and of course, preferably on a film camera. But when I can't, I still want to use it for some other stuff. So a little bit of background, it's nothing new using vintage lenses on modern cameras. Personally, I've been doing it for 4, 5, 6 years. I dabbled with it some, and originally I started using on some professional work when I did food photography. So I worked for a marketing firm for about a year. So all I would do there is food photography. I'd go to restaurants just about every other day, and I'd photograph all their new menu items, go back, edit it, and used it for social, magazines, print, online, advertising, websites, everything. One of the clients we had was a Mexican restaurant. The tiles with the bright reds and greens and yellows and whites and all the shapes, the triangles, squares, all that stuff. The tables had tiles, the floor had tiles, the ceilings had these big ornate chandelier-ish type things with a bunch of lights that just looked really cool. And the restaurant was really long. So what I like to do to kind of shoot social posts and things like that is I would take cocktails or restaurant items, put them near the front of the restaurant, and then try and bring that depth of field into the back with all those lights to kind of give it a unique look. And how I would do that is I would take this vintage Nikkor 55mm 1.2 lens, and I would adapt it, put it on my Fuji, and that would bring in the depth of field because now it's shooting more like an 85. And it would put those lights right behind the subject, and it kind of blew up, and I'll show you an example of how it looked. Now with this, I would shoot it around 1.2 to f2, which I should have stopped it up further to kind of make sure it was more crisp. I don't have access to all these images anymore, so this one will have to do. Because of the way this lens is, the bokeh on this is very unique and very interesting. It's almost hexagonal, octagonal, I can't remember how many sides are on this thing, but you get a very unique boxy subject behind it that really brings in that bokeh. If I had shot that with a modern 85 or 50mm, it would have been basically perfect circle bokeh way in the background. It would have looked great, yes, but it wouldn't have that unique look that I knew I was going to get using this old Nikkor lens, because the aperture on this has fewer blades, so it has a very unique shape. There are other vintage lenses that can provide you a similar look, you know, it varies. Point being is that lens and that bokeh worked for that specific client because that's what I wanted for those specific shots. Would I use that lens for everything? No. Is it the sharpest? I don't think so either. It gave me a unique look that, if you think about it, no one anywhere remotely near me is going to have that same exact look. Few people who have lenses like these use them on modern cameras, and even fewer of them would think to use it in a situation like this. Now, that is not to brag on me. That's just saying if you're doing something like this, you can just further separate yourself, your style, and your portfolio from other people. Another really quick example, in talking with Jude, which is where I went down the rabbit hole of adapters, he told me about a movie on Netflix that had been shot with the Canon Dream lens. So I'd seen this and I loved how it shot. It just had a very surreal look to it, and the depth of field and the bokeh on it just didn't look natural. It almost looked like they had faked it in post because it was just nothing that I had ever really seen in modern cinematic movies or anything like this. Zack Snyder, and it was Army of the Dead, what he did was he bought 3 or 4 of the vintage Canon Dream lenses, 50mm 0.95, and he had them rehoused to be cinema lenses. And if that wasn't enough, he decided he was going to shoot the whole movie at 0.95 on those Canon lenses, which is absolutely absurd because you have the smallest depth of field on those shots. So it has to be pinpoint accurate. And even then, you're not going to have a lot of in focus on your close-ups at all. Now, some people are going to argue, oh, why would you do that? It's going to look awful because it's not sharp, and at 0.95, you don't have any depth of field, and what's the point, and blah, 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 blah. But at the end of the day, he's created a very unique look, and that's the style he was going for and looking for. And I think it played into his hand very well with the storyline and how he wanted that movie shot. That Canon Dream lens, $3 or $4 grand, and then to rehouse it, I'm sure it was like 10 grand a piece, which is, you know, why I've never even looked at buying one because they're so expensive. But man, let me check eBay one more time. So fast forward to now. Of course, I've used my Takumar glass with my Fuji at a 1.4 crop with a regular lens that makes my 50 and 80, my 80 a 135, my 35 a 50, etc., etc. But I got a speed booster for my Fuji, specifically for the M42 mount, which is what my Takumar glass is, and I figured I'll use some Helios glass. If I ever get Leica glass, I can use all that, and I kind of wanted to zone in on what kind of vintage glass I wanted to use on my Fuji and not have to buy a whole bunch of speed boosters and adapters and all that kind of stuff. I kind of want to just pinpoint something, you know, really pinpoint something. In talking with Jude and kind of figuring out different ways I can go with this, I realized I kind of made a mistake, and I'm kind of going to go more towards the route he's gone to. There's just so much good glass I want to use on these modern cameras, and it does make it much easier to test out these lenses and see what works best for you. You know, it's much easier to shoot 4 different 50mm lenses on a DSLR and see how each one of them look with the same subject than try and shoot 5 different 50mm on 5 different film cameras in different settings and different setups with different lighting and subjects and figure out which one works best for you. It makes the process much quicker in figuring out what works for certain things. So real quick, before we get back to how to put a lens like this, you know, Mamiya RB67 6x7 medium format lens onto this, you know, Fuji X T4 or something like that, let me just kind of figure out where we've gone and why we're going this route. Of course, I have the M42 to FX speed booster. That adapter itself was, you know, over $100, which isn't extremely expensive, but it's still not cheap if you want to do this repeatedly and you need to get multiple. So then I was thinking, well, shoot, okay, now I need to get adapters for the other ones, or maybe I just need to adapt them to M42, which sounds simple enough, but those adapters aren't as easily and readily available. However, if you get into modern DSLR cameras, let's say something like the Canon EOS mount. Canon is probably the most widely used brand out there, I would think. So that mount, specifically the EOS, is gonna be very easy to find adapters for. So the route that Jude took, and I'm saying that I came up with it myself too, and I'm expanding upon it, really, it was his idea. I have a FX to Canon EOS adapter here. So what I'm gonna do is get everything adapted to this EOS mount because it is more readily available. And then I have, you know, my Nikon 50mm with a very slim Nikon to Canon EOS adapter on it. And then now I have that 50mm Nikon lens on an EOS to FX adapter with another adapter there. And then I have that vintage buttery smooth Nikon 51.2 as a 51.2 on my Fuji, which is what I want. And then you get down the rabbit hole, okay? So then I can do M42 to EOS. I could do, you know, Exacta to EOS for my Exacta glass, my Nikon glass, there's Minolta glass, there's Konica glass, there's, you know, there's Zeiss glass, the Pentax, Fuji, the Leica, Voigtlander, Biotars, your Noctars, your Takumars, your Bioptars, your Dioptars, and there's just a lot of Optar lenses out there. And they all have a unique, somewhat look to them. Whereas today, modern lenses, they kind of all look rather similar. You can get a 50mm across the spectrum of full frame cameras, and they're gonna look pretty much the same. Now, let's get into some weird stuff. This is a Sony to Pentax 645 mount. Sony to Pentax 645. This is a Pentax 645 45mm 2.8. I can adapt this Pentax 645 lens onto a Sony full frame camera. Now, it's cool in theory, but then it's like, okay, what the heck am I shooting on the Sony? Or better question, if I get the adapter for the RB67 to a Fuji, what am I shooting? How do you crop factor that in? Using a large format lens with an APS-C camera. So I reached out to the guys at PhotoDiox after I saw an article on their website about crop factors and things, and just had some questions for them, and they were very helpful. So you have to use the Pythagorean theorem. So math, yeah, the reason we all went into art. We got to use it again. So it's, you know, a squared plus b squared equals c squared. First of all, you got to take your sensor size. So for the APS-C on the Fuji, it is 23.5 and 15.6. So 23.5 squared times 15.6 squared, that gives you c squared. So you have that number. Now what you have to do is figure out the lens, a squared plus b squared equals c squared. So this is a 6x7 camera. So once you have the numbers for a 6x7, which for this it would be 56 squared plus 67 squared, gives you c squared, okay? So that is, what is that? 87.3. And for the Fuji, it was 28.2. So then you divide 87.3 by 28.2, and that gives you a 3.09 crop factor, or 3.1. So then you would multiply that by the lens. So this is a 90mm lens. So 3.1 times your 90 mil means that this lens on the Fuji is going to be a 279mm lens. Still trying to wrap my head around that. Remember some factors when you're doing this. If you're going to adapt this onto your Fuji, remember you're not going to be using all of the glass. It's basically taking a small section out of that glass, and that's what's going to be used on the Fuji. So you're not going to get the wider depth of field and the soft edges as much as you would with a crop sensor, as if you were to shoot that on a large format camera, which is where it belongs, but point being, or medium format camera, whatever. What if we take it a step further? What if we adapt this Mamiya lens to a Canon EOS adapter and put that 2x converter onto the Fuji? So instead of a 279, it would be like a 135-ish, something like that, I would think, right? Because we're cutting it back in half. So that's a little bit more reasonable. That I could shoot on the Fuji. Not as enjoyable as like an 85 or, you know, 50, but it's much easier to use than a 275mm lens, which is just gonna look absurd on this tiny little, think about this. How ridiculous does this look? I mean, that's just, the lens is bigger than the camera. Can you imagine shooting that? I'm gonna have to try it eventually. I don't care what it looks like. I don't care what I'll take a picture of the grass outside or something, but I'm gonna try that and I'm gonna see how it looks. Now, price-wise, as far as adapters goes, just so you don't freak out. Of course, speed boosters are gonna run you $120 to $150, $170. Just depends on the make, the model, and what you're adapting what to. A regular dummy adapter, you know, with no glass in it, anything like that, this will run you about 20 bucks. And this is gonna keep whatever crop factor you have in. So a 50 is going to be an 85 with a dummy adapter like this. And if you go the other route and you start getting, you know, adapters like an M42 to EOS, which is very thin, very slim, and then you mount that onto your speed booster, your EOS to Fuji, which is what I would have, or a lot of people who shoot full frame, you could get it to straight Sony or to straight Canon, then you're cutting out another adapter, and you don't have to worry about that. Point being is that it is very affordable, very reasonable, and it's a great way to separate you from other people using different lenses, different glass setups, different kits, doing something that a lot of modern photographers are just not doing. This is becoming more and more popular. Obviously, people are doing it for different setups, but it is a great way to learn something new, to improve your skills, to experiment, and just figure out different ways to make images or videos look better using this old glass. So I hope you found that useful. If you have any questions on what adapters I use or anything, again, PhotoDiox has been great. I use a lot of those adapters, not sponsored. Don't have any free adapters from them. But if you have any questions or anything, make sure you leave those down in the comments. I hope you found this useful. I hope it helped you kind of figure out the math and trying to convert these older lenses to different mounts and different sensor sizes. Yeah, that's gonna wrap it up, and I will see you next time.